Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Bharti Kansara, Vice President of American Friends of SOAS, London University, and I am delighted to introduce you all to the distinguished panelists for this, our 11th AFSOAS webinar since the COVID pandemic began. The webinar today focuses on language diversity. Our panelists have transformed the concept of endangered languages documentation with its connotations of a few researchers outside the language community interacting with diminishing numbers of speakers of the dying language to elicit facets of that language to document into the much more dynamic process of maintaining language diversity through the active participation of the language proponents themselves through multimodal collecting, recording, and processing of the language data. Our first panelist is Dr. Mandana Sefedinipor, who spearheaded the SOAS program of ethno-linguistic diversity for 11 years from 2010. In 2014, she became head of the Endangered Languages Digital Archive. In 2021, she moved to Berlin when the ELDP moved to the Brandenburgische Academy of Sciences, becoming its director there. Her work in training and inspiring all the leading researchers in the field is of inestimable value. Next is Dr. Felix Ameka, Professor of Ethno-Linguistic Diversity and Vitality at the University of Leiden, and a leader on the intersection of grammar, meaning, and culture in documenting languages in their multilingual ecologies. An expert on West African languages and a pioneer of cross-cultural semantics, he was elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2019 and of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2015 and of the Academia Europaea in 2021. Since 2015, he has been president of the World Congress of African Linguistica, and is co-editor of the Journal of African Languages and Linguistics, along with Dr. Azeb Amha, our third panelist. Dr. Amha works closely with Dr. Ameka at the African Studies Center at Leiden University on the interface between language and culture, as well as descriptive linguistics. She wrote the first grammar of the Malay language, helped document the Oida language, and is now engaged in multimodal documentation of Zagula from Southwest Ethiopia. Through analysis of Waleta, she has facilitated methodological advances such as the Core AFSOAS and Core Typo projects. Also on the panel are two young field researchers from Ghana, Sodoke and Kenneth Bodua-Mango. Both were trained by Mandana when they came to SOAS for intensive training as scholars funded by SOAS a couple of years ago. Please do donate to American Friends of SOAS so we can continue to fund deserving scholars like Ida and Kenneth. You will find the link to donate in the chat box. Our moderator, Dr. Nasim Nika, holds a master's from SOAS and a PhD from Cambridge University. She presented a wonderful webinar for American Friends of SOAS earlier in the year on the calligraphy that accompanies Safavid and Mughal miniature paintings. We will end with a vote of thanks from our wonderful president of American Friends of SOAS, Greg Bowie. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Nasim Nika, our lovely moderator.
Thank you, Barty. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I am very excited to learn about how our panelists use different methodologies to save and preserve different languages. I am especially interested in learning more about the work that the ELD program has made possible so far. I also want to thank our audience for attending this webinar, and I wanted to let them know that after our panelists have presented their papers, we would like to open the panel to you for questions and discussions. Please feel free to send your questions in the Q&A chat box during the presentation. And I also wanted to let you know that we might go over a little, perhaps for 10 minutes, because we want to allow more time for our closing remarks. And I don't want to take much more time from our speakers. So I would like to now hand down the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mandana, for setting that pace. And you have taken all the words out of my mouth, but I will try and say where we have left off and to see how we are going to be continuing to do language documentation. So in a sense, one can say that over the past almost 30 years, linguists have been embarked on this language documentation. And actually, the time that documentary linguistics came into focus goes to 1998. So we've just been going for some 23 years more. Funding things started years later. Maybe they've just been going for the past 20 years or so. So we've done something, but as Mandana showed in that first graph or first set of slides, there's a lot more. The majority of the languages that need to be documented are spoken by the majority people, and it's only the minority that have a lot of information on their languages. So part of the thing is that indeed, as Mandana pointed out, linguistic diversity is something which is a human species specific property. One of the things which is interesting about our species, which Tomasello points out here, is that the speakers of the same language at different points in historical time would have great difficulties comprehending one another. So this means that we have to be documenting at each stage of the generation. And that is why we need to document now, whatever is there, so to say. In the same way, and I think Mandana pointed this out, there is no other species, as Steve Levinson will put it, on the planet that we know, which has myriad forms at every level in its communication system. And that communication system is embodied in language. Now, when we say language, people tend to think only of the spoken language. And one of the things I would say that documentary linguistics has brought in is first that what language documentation aims at is the record of the linguistic practices and traditions of a speech community. So when we talk about linguistic practices, what do they come about? Basically, we look at texts, the things that are produced, so to say. And when we talk about texts, it's about language use, and this language use within a community, and the language use arises, and this is the critical point, arises in relation to the enactment of social practices. Therefore, in all contexts, we have what one might call activity types, which are culturally recognized activities, which tell us the things that are preoccupations of speakers of a language. Critically, language is multi-modal. It's not just speaking. So when Mandana was talking, you could see her throwing her arms around. You needed that vision, that mode, to be able to interpret exactly how she was talking, what she was talking about. And so one of the impacts, I would say, that language documentation has brought to linguistics is first that we focus on language use. And once you go into language use, then what we are doing is we want to be multi-modal because it is both spoken and vision. And Mandana likes to talk about it as the visual mode of language, so to say. Apart from that, in a way, we talk about standard average European. If we want to talk about standard average human, we should say that a standard average human is multilingual. That is to say, this one language, one person idea is of only a minority set of people. And when we talk about endangered languages are spoken in multilingual contexts. So one of the things that documentary linguistics has also brought about is a recognition of the ecologies, the multilingual ecologies within which we document these languages. And once you have multilingualism, a multilingual ecology, then there are many more languages in the mix, and they are in contact. And these have influence on each other and on the people who speak it. And language variation is just a fact of life. And it is a human species specific feature, and we need to pay attention to it. So the point I'm trying to make here is language documentation has raised the awareness of linguists of certain critical properties of language and communication: multimodality, multilingualism, variation, contact, and so on. Of course, these are the things that make the work of language documentation very, very difficult. So one of the things is that we cannot, all these aspects of language, we cannot handle in one discipline, so to say. So in order to understand this, we need to be cross-disciplinary, we need to be interdisciplinary. And not only that, we also need multi-methods to approach each of the aspects of language, whether it is the gesture we want to look at or the sound system we want to look at. There are various methods that we have to do. And because of that interdisciplinarity, we want to ask the question, what are the challenges that we have been faced given this scope of the work of language documentation? The first one is the limitations of the human capacity. So there's a lot of data recorded, but the value added to that data is not on the same scale. And of course, this is because of the human. So if you record, I don't know, there are all sorts of ratios that people talk about. If you record 5 minutes of something, I mean, this is something people can try. Just record yourself speaking 5 minutes and then try to play it back and transcribe it and see how long it takes you. This is the problem. So one of the things which going forward we need is we need a kind of assistance first to train more people to use their human capacity to do more of the work. So training is a key and a critical aspect of anything that we want to do in language documentation. And the future lies in when we have new technologies that would assist us in the process of what some anthropologists have called inscription. Inscription being you've got a recording and then you add all these things to make it valuable for other people, like transcription, like glossing, like annotating it. And how nice it would be if we can do these things automatically. And so this is the future of the work, that we should have technologies that assist us in doing automatic sort of at least transcription and annotation. And there is a move. So for example, there is a development this is being developed in Australia, ELPIS, which is a kind of machine learning thing which learns the nature of the language. Of course, you still have to provide this machine with the human transcription of a specimen of the language, and then it will learn, and its performance is not too bad. So at least it speeds up part of the process of transcription. Octra is another one which is being developed out of Munich. And what is interesting is there is also what one might call the manual activation tool, which is developed for annotating sign language and can detect gesture also. So you've got your gesture annotation tool also. That helps very much. Manolis is at the Digital Humanities Center in Leiden University, and he has worked on this manual activation tool for automated annotation of sign language and gesture. One of the things I should say when I talk about the training is, yes, last summer we got a bit of help from the Lawrence Center here in Leiden and also the eScience Center of the Netherlands. And we were able to have a less than ideal training session for some of our trainees from Africa on some of these tools that I just mentioned. It was online, so you can understand the challenges of online training for this kind of tools where you cannot have a one-to-one thing. And so that's one of the impacts of the pandemic. Another part of the impact of the pandemic is basically the idea that fieldwork, going to communities to collect data, has been impacted. Well, we all know about the travel restrictions that were imposed, and now it's being lifted, but it is still the case that we need to rethink our way of doing fieldwork. Actually, at the same time as this pandemic, one of the things about fieldwork in the way that it has been done over the years is people have questioned the ideology behind it, that it is a colonial ideology, an outsider going into a community to collect data, to analyze it in the modes and ways determined from outside that community. So one of the directions of language documentation, and it is happening, I mean, I think language documentation has brought about collaboration between researchers and communities, but we need to do more. We need to shake the foundations of the discipline of linguistics in a way that we have to understand language from the point of view of the users of language, not from the point of view of linguists. As Mandana pointed out, there's a lot which is out there, but it is something which is from the perspective of linguistics. Let us give something to the speakers and users of these languages. We need to increase and develop equitable and ethical collaborative ways of doing fieldwork. This is part of the future, and it is now, because now we have the challenges, the challenge of decolonization of everything, and the challenge of the pandemic. Let us be creative. Let us think outside the box to do something better. Thank you.
Yes, you want me to start or?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and to engage in this conversation with Mandana, Felix, and other panelists. Thank you for organizing this. What I would do is that continue from where Felix and Mandana left. I think Mandana sketched nicely the endangerment situation in the world, and Felix also talked about various aspects of language documentation and the thoughts behind it. What I would do is that zoom in into a specific language documentation project, which I'm doing myself, and try to show how some of the points raised, for example, about community engagement and the contributions language endangerment brought for research methodologies in linguistics. These two things I will address. I will start with the methodological aspect. But before that, let me briefly just tell you about my own research. Currently, I have an ELDP project running on the language Zargula, Omotic language, a minority language, highly endangered. This language is spoken in Southwest Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, probably some of you have seen in a UNESCO report in 2003. It was along with Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Sudan. Ethiopia was called one of the African countries which is a crisis area for languages, because a lot of language endangerment is happening in Ethiopia. Currently, we don't know how many languages are spoken, no precise numbers. Some scholars would say 80, some say 100. And there is a language policy in the country which also has its positive sides, but also a way that makes things a bit complicated when you consider, language vitality. It is in that context I'm doing my research. And the language area where I do research, I'll show you in this map. I couldn't run the the presentation mode in my thing. When I do that, the whole screen is good. So can you see these maps?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this is a map of Ethiopia. The language area where I do my research is here, highlighted in green. And I worked in 4 different languages. One here with a yellow arrow is Wolaita, my mother tongue, next to Amharic. So I did research on Wolaita as well, and there I have a different kind of community engagement than in other languages. And as said in the introduction, I did research also in Mali, here with the pink color, where I was myself with Ethiopian background. I was in some way insider, but in other ways outsider, where I did research largely based on text collection, mainly narratives and elicitation and so on. And later I did a language documentation on Oida here in a red color. And that here, Oida is here. This is Argula, this is Wolaita. And so in my research in Oida, I did, I employed the methodologies and tools in language documentation. I show here briefly the area, the 4 languages posted like this. Here is my mother tongue. What I want to emphasize here is that language documentation, even in my own experience, I see that it has changed the way we do research in linguistics by providing, as earlier Felix also said, by providing a good context where advance in research tools, in analytical tools can be tested, where recording analysis of languages is much enriched via language documentation. In my earlier research, I recognize having much power as a researcher, asking the questions directly, determining everything on my own. But now, as language documenter, I have to do with community. And the kind of tools and the kind of recording material we use also force us to collaborate. We are not more a lonely researcher out there and doing things on your own way, but you are largely depend on the communities, doing part of the work together with you. So I will try to demonstrate that how that worked out for me. And the other thing, concerning community collaboration, I want to emphasize that, yes, linguists are dependent on speakers, but in earlier research, a linguist can write a grammar of a language by just working with one person. That happened a lot. People took a single speaker or two, and then outside of their speech community and with whom they have done interviews and are written grammars and dictionaries. It doesn't mean that these works are not important. They have made great contributions to our field, but a number of things like Felix mentioned, research on gesture, research on actual use of language and context were largely missed. But in the current kind of research that we do under language documentation, we decide, first of all, to study language via the day-to-day life of people. What is salient in a community, their way of life is from where we start to investigate language. For example, my people, the Dargula area, they are farmers. And what I did was to do research about their farming activity. And people really love to talk about things that preoccupy them, that are part of their nature, part of their life. So they really love that we are doing this on farming activities. So the kind of things they cultivate, how they cultivate, what kind of technology they use to cultivate. And next to that, I look into house construction. So those were the two themes. I can explain later in the question and answer if things come up, why these two, house construction and farming. But to say briefly, these two things are unmissable in the culture, and I'm looking into that. Okay. So let me just show you a few examples of how important it is to engage with community. Here I have one of my major assistants, Asmallash Mikael. He's a farmer himself. He did high school and he has a diploma, but he was not employed, and he returned back to his family's village where he continued to work as farmer, and sometimes when there are jobs are available, other things as well. And he was really a very important, he is still a very good friend, very good contributor to my work, because what I did was in my language documentation to use my research assistants and consultants. The assistants not only give me information, but they are involved together with me in recording material, in analyzing it, and also in transcribing it. So why is that necessary? Why is it helpful? When I went first to do field work, I wanted to do on farming, but it happened that drought came in that year. So I couldn't really observe, I couldn't record people while they were engaged in the work. And I was told to come back next year on this time. And when I went back in the time I was told to come, it was too much rain, so I couldn't do really proper recording. But what saved me, next to the narratives and so on, was that I trained Mikael the way I use camera. I myself am not a good camera person, but what I did was the little I learned from the ELDP training, I tried to give on to him, and I left the equipment with him. So he was very good in recording in very difficult terrains, like you see here on the left, about farming activities in which people were doing work. And it was really very fantastic material about, you know, the interaction between people, the things they talk. And another very important video here is where he recorded flooding. When it happened, I was not there. He recorded that and he could show it to authorities so that they could get help. These are things people find interesting. They find it useful to do in this way. In my analysis also, they were at all times directly involved in the transcription, in segmenting things for later. For example, I could take more computers where they did Pratt segmentation. We discussed, they discussed here, as you could see briefly, just to show you some. So what I wanted to illustrate here is that for every, you know, in the translation step also, where for every important word, for example, here, difficult negative construction with a nominal, they are discussing things in detail, how that works. So for the grammar also, you get a very rich context and a direct contribution. If I just relied on word by word translation, I wouldn't get to that, but they take their time, they put their heads together, as you can see here, literally, to discuss things in detail and give me context and help. Not only that, in that transcription, I also allow them to do things to do the interview for me also. While I'm interviewing also, they know they can talk better about farming and house constructions than I do. And I would ask them, you know, this is what I want to learn. Try to ask those questions in your own language instead of me using like Amharic or something, an intermediary language when I work with a monolingual. So in that had helped me a lot. And this is what we should really strengthen in language documentation. Just to wrap up, both we linguists as you know, as a research community, but our universities and funding initiatives should really strengthen and support this community collaboration, because we are not there all the time to do the recording. Even after we have left, people can carry on with documentation if they are trained and if they have tools. And this is exactly what my consultants are doing. Thank you very much. I will stop here. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Azeb.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So my name is Sodoke, and I am very much happy to be here. For this section, I will be joining my colleague, Kenneth Bodua-Mango will be joining me so that we do this together. And our language documentation started with our PhD journey. We set out to work on an endangered language, namely Enimere, which is spoken in the Oti region of Ghana. It is a highly endangered language. And so for our PhD proposal, we're looking at, I was going to work on the everyday language used by Enimere speakers, and then Kenneth was going to look at complex sentences and clause linkages in enumerate. And so subsequent to this intention to document an endangered language, we were very much fortunate to receive a scholarship from the American Friends of SOAS to partake in an 8-day intensive training on language documentation that was facilitated by the ELDP at SOAS. In this training, we were taken through a series of topics, and for us, what really benefited us the most were topics on audio and video recording, the use of FFmpeg to edit videos, and then also the use of ELAN to do transcription, as well as data management. Particularly for me, I had done some field work for my MPhil and bachelor's degree, but I had not received any training of the sort that was given to us at SOAS. So it came as a very golden opportunity for me to be part of such a training, considering the fact that for my PhD research, it was going to be bigger comparatively to the MPhil and bachelor's degree. So the scholarship and the training came as a very wonderful opportunity for me to learn. Now, subsequent to our training in SOAS, we paid a preliminary visit to the speech community, that is the Nkwanta, to conduct a socio-linguistic survey on the domain of language use by the speakers. Thankfully, the training we received at SOAS was a hands-on kind of training where, even though we were not in the field, we experienced the field right from the training grounds. There were times where we were given simple tasks to perform. So I remember from after the sessions on audio and video recording, we were sent out to SOAS campus to do random recording and all. And this came to me as a very useful exercise, because I had no knowledge about how to use the camera to set up the audio recording device and what to look out for. But because I had received all this training at SOAS, going to the field to do this social linguistic survey came to me very much easily. I quite remember when we had to do our video recording, we had to decide on the appropriate location, but because we had already been taught by Mandana and the other facilitators that we needed to get a very quiet location, we had to change the previous location that we're going to do the recording, because there was so much echo in the room, to a conducive environment. And that survey came out very successfully. And I would say that it is all thanks to the training that we received. And our department in Ghana, also knowing the kind of training we receive from SOAS, from time to time, utilize our skills. So for me personally, I had the opportunity to work on with another endangered language, namely Sele, spoken in the Central Kofi Volta region of Ghana with one of my lecturers, as where I was mainly in charge of the video and audio recording session of that survey. So I would want to call on Mango to also share a few of his personal experience in the field, and then we'll take it out from there.
Yeah, thank you. As Ida mentioned, the training came in handy and quite timely, and because we were just we're just about finishing our coursework, and one of the coursework was a field work, and we spent a lot of the time as facilitators in terms of management of equipment and other things. And this, aside from that, we have had countless opportunities to revise the training we have had. So, for instance, I had an opportunity to go to University of Education whenever to have a talk on Flex with their national service personnel. I think at the time they were thinking about creating dictionaries for all the languages that they teach there, and so based on that, I was invited to have a talk with them and a hands-on session on the use of Flex, and so that was another opportunity for us to share our experience because we apart from for ourselves, it thought it was an opportunity to share the knowledge. Next, Ida. Well, by way of challenges, the ride has been interesting, but we have come across some challenges. So the most pronounced one is the impact of COVID-19, which resulted in the suspension of the 2019-2020 grant session, which we're hoping that maybe we could have been successful in application to document anemone. Another challenge we face is a lack of equipment. The ELDP program, training program that was held in Winneba, during that time, some equipment were donated to the University of Education, Winneba, the College of Languages. But the problem is that a lot of their staff are also on PhD attempting to upgrade themselves. So a lot of the time, when you want the equipment to use, it's always occupied. So one person is using it, one other person is using it. So that is a bit of a challenge. And the other universities don't really have what do you call it, these equipments for us. So that, by way of challenges, those are the challenges we have encountered. However, however, we don't intend to give up on documentation. So even though we have veered off a bit from anemone, we still remain in documentation. So for instance, I am doing a documentation of endangered oral genus in Gonja. Now, the Gonja on its own is not necessarily an endangered language. However, the oral genus and cultural practices are very, very endangered because of mainly Islam. So the Gonja people are mostly Muslims, and because of that, the oral traditions are dying out quite and being replaced by Islamic traditions. So this is an opportunity for us to document them and preserve them so that in future we would be able to have access to what the Gonja oral genus were. And I think Ida is doing similar with cuisine. Ida.
Yes, so like Mango said, the COVID has kind of redirected our research focus. And yes, we are not able to currently work on enumerate because of the suspension of the ELDP grant on 2 successive years. And because our work as PhD students is time-bound, it became necessary that we found something to do just to meet the timelines for our PhD studies. And so for me, I'm also going to be still working on documentation, but I'm refocusing on endangered indigenous food practices, as well as looking at the equipment that are used in preparing these dishes. And I'm going to be looking at this in the Ewe and Akan language of Ghana. Once again, these are also not endangered languages, but then there are a lot of indigenous cuisines that we no longer see in our homes with regard to these cultures. And so I feel like if these food practices are no longer in existence, then their linguistic practices are also likely to go into extinction. So it is a necessary call for something to be done in this area. And so that is the new research focus for my PhD studies. And we once again would like to say very much thank you to the American Friends of SOAS for their support for us to get this language documentation training at SOAS. All the skills that we acquired from this training is still useful to us in the new research focus that we have. And we hope to, we are confident that going to the field is going to be highly successful, and we are hopeful to do a very good PhD research to contribute to current knowledge on documentary linguistics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ida, and thank you, Kenneth. All the best wishes for you for completing your PhD. It must be really difficult to continue, especially during this time. But I hope with some opening up, things are becoming a little easier. But I want to be mindful of time, and I don't want to. I want to leave enough time for us to ask questions. So without saying much, I want to get to it right away and use my privilege to ask the few questions that I have first. And then I have some messages here and some questions here that I would like to ask. Mandana, I really enjoyed listening to how the project came about and what does endangered languages mean, and the description of the field. And I wanted to know a little bit more about its history. When did we start recording endangered languages? And also was wondering, how do we define a language as endangered? What category is used? And then my other question was something that Azeb, I think, touched upon a little bit, and then Ida, Felix, and Kenneth also talked a bit about, which is the methodology you use for your research, or selecting how you want to record a language. How do you get to, how do you choose what activity you want the community to perform, or what kind of discussions you want to start having first? I know that we heard a little bit about the community that Azeb is working with, and farming was what you selected to start with. But can you give us a few more examples about how you select your activities or your discussions for recording?
Who do you want to start first?
I asked too many questions. I did say I'm excited for this talk. So
Do you want me to start first because it's the beginning? I mean, there always have been linguists and missionaries and people going to the field and recording languages in some or another way. But the start of modern language and digital language documentation, I would say, is about 25 years old. It was in the 90s that linguists stood up and warned about language endangerment and the developments that we can observe. And with that, also the advent of the digital revolution came, and the digital allows us now to go to the field and with very light equipment and to record a lot, while in the earlier days, people had to use reel-to-reel tapes or, wax cylinders in the beginning of the centuries. Now it is possible to take an audio recorder and a video recorder and to record a lot of data, even though you might not transcribe and analyze it all. So that's basically the history, the modern history of language documentation. I would say it started 25 years ago. And here I'm talking digital language documentation, because the digital allowed us now to really step up things that was not possible before. What was the second part of your question?
I was wondering how a language becomes, how do you categorize a language as endangered?
There are scales on which you can look, but I think the
the key indicator is whether or not children speak it. That's the one, because the moment the children don't learn the language anymore, or when it becomes restricted to the home and children only speak it at home, but everything outside is another language, then that's when the language becomes endangered. The moment one generation of children doesn't learn the language anymore, it's very hard to reinvigorate it. It's very hard to bring it back, because these languages are not being used. And what is happening is that the spaces where the language are getting used are getting less and less and less. And language is like sports. If you don't practice it, it goes away. But you can see the intergenerational transmission breaks, the transmission from the parent generation to the children. That's when the language goes away. That's the strongest indicator. That's the most reliable and strongest indicator we have.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And then
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Shall I comment on the yes, on the methodology, where we get started in language documentation? I think already when one proposes to do language documentation, one wouldn't simply say, I go document X, but one needs to, I think, define. These are, some people might do it, but I think in general, the best practice is from people's lives, where do you want to focus? Depending on the culture, depending on the environment, you want to focus on something. And then once there, for example, in my case, I said I chose to work on farming. It's a huge concept, and I just can't go and ask, how do you do your farming? So we can start with small things like, where is your farm? How did you acquire the land? Is it your land? And then what do you grow in it? And then you start to look by, recording things that they grow. And then, in my case, for example, Zargula is a mountainous area. They specialize in a product that's called teff. And they are very proud of that product. So I started recording about teff, from preparing the land for teff. You know how it requires 3 rounds of plowing, and then different care, and up to the last moment when they are harvested and they put the grain into a container. So that step, I was lucky. I was not able to record everything myself physically, but part of it via my consultants. In the times when I was away and the season needed it, they recorded the work for me. So we have now, from the sowing, the preparation of the land, sowing to the end product, we go like that. And one by one, the things they grew, from ginger, spices, to all kinds of products, and also new things that they learn. How, for example, ways of living change, this kind of documentation. It's not only for the language, and it's not only, it is their life. So how are, for example, I know, for example, who brought a specific spice called kororuma to the area, and who first planted it, and how that plant went from one family to the next. And I think these are very important records of people's lives, and how, if there are changes in society, how these developments come about. So I find it really exciting and very interesting how people adapt to things, how they learn a new thing like mango and avocado, which has not been there in the last maybe a decade or two, but now how that is being adapted and being appropriated into the culture, into their farming activity. So I'm learning myself, and also I think if you look into my archive at LR in the ELDP site, you could see that from big to small, the kind of products raised in the area and how they are done. You could see an audio and video form of it. So that's how we go. And this is distinctly different from how we did linguistics, by asking for specific words. For example, how do you say the word chair, and then you transcribe that, and please make a sentence with chair. Now we do the reverse. We have this whole authentic, real life recordings from which we can extract any word, any grammar, any sentence in the language. So that makes it tough. It is a heavy work. You can get into the grammatical systems of a language very fast if you follow a highly narrowed methodology like elicitation and sentence by sentence transcription, and working out your grammar from that is very fast. But if you use these recordings from which you extract grammatical properties of languages, you have a rich context where any linguist anywhere can look into my analysis and say, okay, this sentence is extracted from such a text and it shows this thing. I can compare it to other languages and I can understand how that grammar works. So that is major methodological leap, I think. And another thing I want to briefly mention is that we are not only just stopping on this, we are not throwing away the good things of elicitation and working with narrow step-by-step methods of linguistics, but we combine them very fruitful.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Azeb. I want to perhaps ask one question, which is a bit more broad question about support, and then pass on the mic to Greg, unfortunately, for our closing remarks. But I hope you do in the future contact our these scholars if you have any further questions. I'm sorry we ran out of time a little bit, but the question that I have here is what are the panelists' view on the relationship between indigenous languages, examples UNESCO Decade of Indigenous Languages, and endangered languages? I think the question's mainly about the difference between the two.
Okay, let me briefly.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, I mean, this is one of the challenges in the area. We throw about these terms: endangered, indigenous, minority. In a sense, that's not the critical point. So, okay, maybe the way to address the issue is first, the UN, the UNESCO Indigenous Languages Decade, we had the Indigenous Languages Year, and that is tied to an indigenous peoples sort of committee, which is also with UNESCO. So there is indigenous peoples, and these indigenous peoples speak indigenous languages. And one of the things that this year and decade is supposed to do is to bring about the upliftment of those languages. Mm-hmm. Yes, these indigenous languages are endangered, but these terms don't tell us too much. I think the critical thing, as Mandana said about endangerment, is if the language is not transmitted, then it is on the way out. And that's the key. For some of those indigenous languages, they are still spoken by children. And actually, the challenge for those languages, if I may say it that way, is not so much about the transmission, it's more about socio-political, economic domination by other languages. So part of the thing about the Indigenous Decade is to, if you like, promote the dominated languages from their underdog nature, and for us to be aware of what is happening to languages. I think the graphs that Mandana shows us what dominance really means in a way. So lots of languages are dominated, but they are not necessarily of indigenous people. So this is why there is also a bit of a political issue about indigenous, a political issue about endangerment, a political issue about minority. So the terms as such mean too much in certain contexts. What is critical for us is to have an understanding of the contexts, the situations that lead to endangerment, the situation that leads to dominance. And that happens in several domains, even within places where you might say there are only indigenous languages. Some indigenous languages also dominate other indigenous languages. And so there is a dynamic between languages that we need to be aware of and to uplift them from their dominance, so to say.
Thank you, Felix. That was great. I really enjoyed learning about how interdisciplinary the field is, how it has come so far, even though it's fairly a young field, the digital version of it, and how it's also evolving with technology and with different methods, and hopefully with more funding and with more innovations, we can make sure we lose less and less of these treasures that we have. So I don't want to take much more of your time. I know some of our speakers are joining us from places which is already quite late at night. Before too long, I want to pass on the mic to Greg. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Nasim. Yes, I'll be very quick here. I just want to extend our gratitude to all of you, our amazing, talented panel today. It's such a pleasure to hear all of you talk. This is a topic that's of great interest to myself, I know to Nasim and lots of others who've joined us. So we're extremely grateful for all of you, not just for being with us today, but more importantly for the important work that you're doing. I'm personally just really grateful that there are people like you who are so knowledgeable and passionate who are out there doing this really critical work. So thank you. I also want to thank Bharti Kansara, who is our AFSOAS Vice President, for organizing another great panel, as always. And, you know, this type of event that we have is really important. We've had a lot of great conversations through this AFSOAS virtual event series. And just one final appeal to all of you, if you enjoyed today's talk, we would really appreciate your support, which would enable us to host more events like this in the future. So even if you're able to give $5 or $10, it goes a long way, and we really do appreciate it. I put a link in the chat box earlier. And that's all. I really appreciate everyone for making the time to be with us today and for engaging in such an important conversation. So thank you all, and hope you have a great day.